So you know it's not a crime to be fascinated by all things criminal. And if you do like delving into the underworld, why not join us for a special live show on March 27th at the Cork Opera House. We'll be talking about the making of a cartel and all the wild and crazy stories that happened along the way. So why not join us for this special live show? Tickets from corkpodcastfestival.ie. Tanya Fowles, welcome back to Crime World. And we decided we'd just have a quick update on what's been happening in the story, the case of the murder of Katie Simpson and the subsequent death at his own hand of her killer, Jonathan Creswell. The last we were talking, there was a lot of investigations going on. The police ombudsman have made some headway with this, but there's other investigations ongoing into how the case was investigated and into complaints that have been made along the way by various people. But I suppose start with, is there any indication yet when there may be an inquest into the death of Katie?
No, and thanks for having me back, Nicola. No, it's going to be some considerable time. It's vast. There are a lot of aspects to it, and it's going to take a long time to get that prepared before it's ever going to be. And it still hasn't been decided if it'll be heard by a jury, which means a completely different setup. It'll probably move to High Court or be heard by a High Court judge. Hard to know, but at the minute, it's too vast and not even nearly ready.
Now, we've seen a number of documentaries have come out on this. Death of a Showjumper was the Sky documentary. There was a more recent documentary on Virgin Media and Channel 4, or it's due to go on Channel 4. Our own podcast, Groomed, is available for anybody who wishes to listen to our version of our portrayal of this story. And the BBC made podcasts. I wrote a book on it, etc., etc. So there's been a huge amount of publicity. Is there any suggestion yet that this story is going away, or will the investigations keep it alive? Is there more to be discovered?
Oh, so much. It's a long way off. There, nearly when the trial ended or when the sentencing aspect ended, it opened the doors because there is so much went wrong. It's multi-agency. There were failures, epic failures on many levels. It's required very careful consideration over, nearly going back years to find out what went wrong. And there are small things that we're looking at now. Like, for example, I unsurprisingly I put an FOI in for the PSNI's death investigation manual, and they have now got this thing in, which must have only gone in recently, which is called Investigative Mindset ABC. Mm-hmm. And the A is assume nothing. The B is believe no one. And C is consider everything. So that's the complete opposite of what was done.
And for those who don't recall, let's go back over the facts of what happened here. Katie Simpson was brought to our Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry in August of 2020 by her sister, Christina Simpson's partner, Jonathan Creswell. She had been living with Christina and Jonathan and working with them over a period of time. And he presented her actually on the side of the road to an ambulance, having said he'd found her having hung herself in the house they lived in Derry. And his word essentially was taken. Katie died some 8 days after being admitted to the hospital, and she was buried in a local cemetery in Tynan, in the village in Armagh where she came from. Now, the first investigation, despite calls from a lot of people, sort of concluded that this was a suicide. There was nothing to see here.
Yes, and that's something that we're scratching into a little bit more, because Katie is presented, and let's just say we pick it up from where she's arrives at hospital.
Yeah.
That would have been probably in and around 9 o'clock on the morning of 9 o'clock on the 3rd of August 2020. And the instruction is given not to wash her. They're going to rape kit test, all these things, which would be standard in any situation. It's not that at that point, anything in those terms, particularly as she had all these injuries. But I think it was by 12 noon, that was stood down. So it obviously was declared non-suspicious within hours. And the narrative is believed. Okay, look, on hindsight, everything's 2020. We get that. But, you do not go months, especially when people are actually banging the door and saying strangulation threat here. We've also found another problem
and people
here.
including, there was a number of people who were kind of trying to bang the door down of the police in Derry to sort of say to them, you may need to look at that. Relatives of Katie, friends of Katie, people who knew Jonathan Creswell, and even somebody who was working in the hospital sort of, went to them to say, there's something not right here.
A number of people did, and even that has been construed differently now because, first of all, they said public first spoke out on the 11th. Chief Constable said that, and that had to be corrected. It was actually the 4th. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of things going on. It did not gather the momentum it needed to. And as one thing that again comes up is that his record was checked as a person presenting at the roadside. If I did it, they'd look up to see if I have a record, in these circumstances, but not Johnny. So we've now found out that even if it wasn't showing on the PSNI computer, it was showing on the UK PNC, or the police national computer. They could have flipped very easily over and checked that because, we really were rattling and saying, look, he has convictions, and they're saying, they didn't even say they couldn't find them. That all came out later. But and the other, something that actually just only recently we learned of, Sarah in Scotland. She has been trying to get this man arrested since 2016, early 2017, when she made her complaint. He, of course, goes AWOL. That would have been on the computer too. So technically, and while you would maybe do it under those circumstances, technically he could have been arrested at the roadside for her case.
And let's remind the listeners who Sarah in Scotland was. She was a girl who was working in the horse industry. She was working in a stables in Antrim along with her boyfriend, and Johnny Creswell was working in the same stables, and he basically exposed himself to her and threatened her and her boyfriend, I think telling the boyfriend that he'd snap his back and various things like that. He had kind of got into an argument with them, tried to take Sarah sort of aside and whatever it was that he felt he was doing with people, but I think he wasn't getting anywhere with her and seemed to turn nasty on her. They had made a complaint to both the stable owner and to the PSNI, through Scotland, because they went back to Scotland and they made the complaint to the Scottish police, who passed it on to the PSNI, and they were actively looking for Johnny Creswell to question him in relation to this. He had moved over the border to live with his father briefly, but your investigations found that he was over and back and often in the same stables where this alleged incident had occurred.
Yep. And whenever Sarah finally did put a complaint in about that, the poor investigation to get him, she was declined because the police said, no, we tried, and presented evidence to that effect. And her complaint was dismissed, but it wasn't making any sense. So we gathered the information up that we'd found. We took it back to the Ombudsman, who reopened the complaint. And now Sarah has had her entire complaint upheld in full. And that is a broad-reaching complaint. There are issues about ownership. The same thing comes up, ownership of cases, things falling off the record. But something that made Sarah jump was when Johnny was arrested in Katie's case and went for High Court bail. She was listening to the coverage and she heard sections of her original statement being recalled as evidence as to why he should not get bail. And nobody has at this stage gone back to her and said, we're going back to your case. But even at that, there were ample opportunities there to arrest him for that, even while he was in custody. They could have lifted him then. She had to wait until his trial was going to be over, although he knew it was coming. He was aware that there was a report in with the PPS and the charge was being reactivated. But it was just one after another of very poor handling. Then we then I started asking just bog standard questions. If he's in the Republic of Ireland, when did the PSNI alert An Garda Síochána? For a number of reasons. One, yes, to get him for the sake of Sarah, but what about the safety risks he may have posed? This is a man who frequented with young women in great numbers, and he clearly was building up a reputation of being predatory, of being abusive, not just sexually abusive, but physically, and there was no effort made to put any safeguarding in place, or get him for that matter. So,
and of course, Tanya, what happened was it took really until the end of that year, 2020. Like Johnny Creswell was chief mourner essentially at Katie Simpson's funeral. He helped lower her coffin into the grave, and he got on with life and went back to the racetracks and went back to business, having murdered her. And later a plot to help him cover up would be discovered as well, involving 3 women she would have considered to be friends of hers. Now, it took until really the end of the year 2020 and the turn into 2021, the January, by which time a new investigative team was appointed to the case. And they very quickly established that they believed that Katie Simpson had been murdered and that Jonathan Creswell was their chief suspect. He was arrested, and you spoke about bail there. He did eventually get bail as he awaited trial for her murder.
He was initially, when he went to the first magistrates' court, he was refused bail, and then he appealed to High Court, which is his right, of course. I remember that hearing, and it was troubling because it was so, you could see the dots weren't joining up. There'd been so much material lost, evidential, everything was lost by the first team doing absolutely nothing. And I don't mean that as an insult to the ones who tried to do something. I mean the people who turned away. And, I'm hearing about this lack of investigative mindset. Well, even back in 2010, the PSNI adopted a recommendation by the Ombudsman, which was to treat every unexpected death as suspicious until proved otherwise. That did not happen with Katie. And
that, of course, came as part of the recommendations into their handling of the case that people might know as the dentist. Colin Howell, who would later be played on screen by Jimmy Nesbitt. But in that case, Colin Howell, a dentist, and he was having an affair with a lady called Hazel Stewart. They had plotted, and he had basically killed their partners, staged it as a double suicide, and they had gone on to get away with that. And it was quite similar. And when you see what the Ombudsman in 2010, the only reason, by the way, that one was solved was because Colin Howell took he decided to confess, and he came in and he admitted what he'd done. But the Ombudsman report identified a lot of the things that happen 10 years later than in Katie's case, which is very disappointing. And now you go back to your ABC.
Yeah, which is, and whether I'm trying to establish when it was introduced, because it was assume nothing, believe no one, challenge everything. That's your ABC. And none of those applied. None of them applied. But I mean, do you need that written out? Is that not what police do? It's a keep on saying this is a death in quite brutal circumstances, and the ease of which it could be. It wasn't even that well presented, about he did this. No, I found her. It was you were in court. You saw the CCTV or the body-worn footage. The man lies 3 times in a very short period of time. And you're wondering, I remember she once said it was almost like he hypnotized people. There just seems to be this desire it's one or two things in my book: get this over with, walk away, or it seems all right, leave it as it is. We're going to make waves.
So Johnny Creswell obviously took his own life, and that murder trial never occurred. But there was a huge amount of investigation done in advance for that trial. I think 140 witnesses or thereabouts were going to be called. All of that evidence surely is done for the coroner's court, because the coroner's court essentially is an investigation into how somebody died. And in the case of Katie Simpson, no doubt her family would be looking for a verdict of death by murder.
Well, yeah, this is what we're struggling against, because given the length of time inquests take, particularly in huge cases, this is being used to stymie any efforts to dig a little further, or we can get some information, but it's all we can't give you that. That's for the coroner. Some of us are not going to wait that long, and an inquest can do one of two. Its remit is establish the cause of death, and probably in Katie's case, how it came about. Now, if you look, for example, at the current Noah Donoghue trial or inquest that's going on, that's slightly different in that they're trying to build a picture. You're hearing all the evidence because they're trying to build a picture to give the jury, something to work with. So you're hearing evidence from people who saw him, because there's a gap there of a number of days which are blank. And they have to be able to pull all that together and come to a reasonable conclusion. Now, the coroner can do nothing about police. They can do nothing about prosecutions. They can recommend prosecutions. That's not to say they'll get them, but they can make a recommendation to the PPS to look at a matter, but they definitely cannot order anything. It's almost like a civil hearing where you're getting the facts, and we know that there is so much error and ineptitude here, and why it's so. I accept everybody has to be able to have their say. I understand that, or maybe explain away. But what are they going to be doing in that hearing is simply talking about the moment Katie is presented to hospital. Okay, they may go back a little bit, which is more than the PSNI did. They did not go back far enough to establish movements and stuff. There's major issues over some evidence within the short, already sort of available ombudsman inquiry. There's errors there that they are now resistant to change, even though they could change the whole structure and pattern of the outcome. But there is nothing that can be done by the coroner except make a finding. But I do accept people have to have a voice, and they are entitled to have that voice.
So Tanya, in the meantime, time passes, doesn't it? Of course, because it's we're coming up to this summer. It's going to be 6 years since Katie has died, and again the same with Jonathan Creswell. And in all that time, people that are identified between ombudsman's reports, who are the subject of queries that yourself and others are putting in, are retiring, leaving, going their own way. What is the situation, perhaps, with those who are identified in the original ombudsman's report? How many people who are identified in that report have since retired or left the police service for another reason?
Well, if we break it into two, we'll call it investigation one, and the investigation into that was 6 officers were cited, of which one was cleared, and then you had 3 officers. I mix this up. I don't know if it's 2 were disciplined and 2 got advice, but 3, as we think it's 3, retired while under investigation. No law against that. that it can't. In my book, maybe some of these people should have been suspended, but there had to be grounds, and clearly nobody was pointing to any ground.
Is that slightly different to the way it happens in the UK? If you're under investigation, even if you retire, you can still be investigated for a period of time after that retirement.
You can. We've since heard that there's one case currently. We got a statement from the PSNI and the Ombudsman, and they said they've no power to prevent retiring unless you can retire, but if it's criminal, it'll still come after you. But if it's internal misconduct, well, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
Even for future learning, wouldn't you want to have some level of accountability there? So that's the first investigation. So we'll skip into the next one, because after the trial collapsed, I suppose, and the women were sentenced, a load more stuff came in, one of which was Sarah's revamped complaint. And this specialist team was brought in to take it on. And so you've 3 more complaints in, one of which related to the first investigation, as in investigation 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but we clumped them all together. And of the second tranche of Ombudsman investigations, we've now 7 officers cited, of which 5 have retired. And we only found out recently that a second detective chief inspector has gone.
Mm.
So the most senior level in investigations, and they're all walking away. Now, we know who they all are. We know their rank. We know what they've been reported for. We know we're affording them the courtesy of anonymity at this stage, but we know. And we've seen, I've spoken to all the complainants. I've spoken to the witnesses to those complainants. I'm one of the complainants. I know what I need sorted. They know. And as I said, so far, Sarah has been successful and her complaint is over the line. And she still hasn't come back. She still hasn't fathomed yet how it took so long.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, I was talking to her last week, actually, and she said, I finally got my statement. This happened. She made the statement in 2016.
10 years.
She fought the PSNI to get that, and she finally got it. And I've seen it, and it's raw.
Mm.
It's brutal. And there was enough in there to at least trigger a concern for other people's welfare. Okay, it wasn't a conviction. It was still an allegation at that stage.
Yeah, an allegation against somebody with a serious conviction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much
different,
so.
because of course, and we've spoken about this before, he was convicted in relation to a series of assaults on Abigail Lyle, a previous girlfriend. He went to jail for that, and she spoke out in relation to what had happened to her a number of times over the years. So this isn't somebody with a crystal clear record, has never laid a finger on any woman before. This is somebody with history. So you'd imagine that again should make people take things more seriously. What you feel very strongly about this, that there's various different strands and you're struggling all the time to try and get a small little piece of information to add to the jigsaw. But for you, I think it would be simpler, and you feel very strongly that there should be a full inquiry into what's happened here.
Without a doubt. It's too big for the Ombudsman. It's off the scale. This needs a public, legally binding inquiry where people give evidence under oath what they did, and that call up all the retired police officers. Who knows? They may have some chink there which could be set in stone and change things around, because we're always hearing about lessons learned, and I am wary of that. But on the other hand, it's all we ever get thrown at is, I'm not saying it. I'm saying, bad lessons repeating. And I actually spoke to a police officer last week who said, you go in, and in your first 2 or 3 years, you're so determined you're going to change the world, you're going to help people, you're going to get involved in, in community and try and, talk to people and be community. He says, after 5 years, you're jaded. And you start, and I can see that. I can see it in officers coming to court who are trying to keep certain people, for example, remanded in custody, and they're trying to give the best case they can. And then you'll find a judge will find a flaw and they'll release them. You can just see them deflating and think, but they've tried. But it's the ones who are just simply walking away I really struggle with, because some of the conduct has been unconscionable. We'll have to see if it becomes illegal. We know that there's a warning that some of them may be criminal. So we just have to wait and see. And it's always the waiting game.
Mm-hmm. It always seems to be with this case. How were the documentaries, etc., taken in the general area? Was there a lot of talk about them? To your knowledge, have the equestrian centres, have the equestrian industry started to maybe take a look at itself and you know, how women fit in, young women fit in this as a sport?
I think it was quite stark, and some people maybe didn't know it was as bad as it was. There are others I thought were quite blasé about the whole thing. But whatever way you look at it, and I know people are going to say, if you're over 18, you can do what you like. Fine. Your book's called Groomed. You know that this starts young. And I constantly talk about a livery yard near me that does riding lessons. And they have a rule that an adult remains on the premises connected to that child during that. It's a 1 hour lesson. And, you know, they're encouraged to sort of stay about. And that's a very good safeguard. It's because the parent is our guardian, or whoever it might be, is there and can make a call and make a judgment call if they're distressed. And kids do get a wee bit distressed, or there's maybe they take a wee tumble. You know, sometimes they need to go to hospital. Sometimes they just need TLC. And who better to do that than your closest relative? And, you know, cajole you on a wee bit. But when you have other people who, as Johnny would have done, it struck me quite recently that Johnny would have done what he called a scramble, and he would have had all the kids, the younger ones round him, predominantly girls, and he would have lifted change from his pocket and flung it, and the kids all had to go and grab. And, you know, it was all very much like he was the clown, he was the entertainer. And but then kids don't necessarily know. And I mean, do you start by overemphasizing stuff at a young age? You know, where do you start? What we found was child protection, vulnerable adult protection is lacking. Not in that yard and not in quite a few yards, but it is not considered high enough up the scale. And there's one thing that we're really getting into now is the exploitation. We've since found out that Johnny would have taken Katie when she was still a child and put her on a racehorse for trainers. You do not put a 12 or 13-year-old child on a horse. You put them on a pony. And you certainly don't put them on a mad, very finely tuned animal that's built for speed. You don't do it, but because children are lighter and under the 9 stone, so somebody would have given Johnny the money for Katie to ride the horse out on gallops, capable or not. That was a horrendously dangerous situation, horrendously dangerous. But he made the money off it, and she probably got a couple of quid pocket money.
And again, blind eyes were shown to that situation.
Very much. I really felt for Sarah when I read the statement. She's talked to me. She's given me bits and pieces over the years. We've been in contact. But when I read the statement, it was so raw, and the lack of support and the lack of interest. And something that I found terrifying actually was when she complained about inappropriate behaviour. Instead of addressing the issue, the trainer called everybody into a room together and put it out that they'd received this, and she was humiliated. They didn't say it was her, but they all knew it. It didn't take long. And then that got Johnny's back up. Oh, you, and he has the whole yard against them. that ostracization, we saw that with Abby. She was more or less out of the country, but it's worked out the best for her.
Yeah.
But, she took so long to get her confidence back. And she, really, there it was again. Everybody has to stick friendly with me. And these owners, they don't care as long as their horses are winning.
Mm-hmm.
And, that has got to stop. I know you're going to get people saying, well, surely it's not my business. But domestic violence, abuse of any kind is everybody's business. And I don't say it's easy, but there are plenty of ways that you can quietly make those concerns known. If you can't put your head over the parapet, and I understand that, there are whistleblower procedures, there's Crime Stoppers, there's anonymous ways to do it, and at least get the ball rolling, because I would far rather be talking to Katie, having come through some level of this and out the other end, than to visit her grave. And I that is the stark reality here. Those things are accumulative, and especially anybody who would put their hands around a person's throat repeatedly, that will end. I think there are statistics out now that it says that a person who inflicts a strangulation injury is just a rap on the wall away from murder. Killing in that. And we've actually tried to say, should the non-fatal strangulation really be encompassed under attempted murder? But nobody wants to hear that.
Well, if there was an award for perseverance on it all, Tanya, you would get it. There's no doubt. You talk about people getting tired after 5 years. In August, it'll be 6 years after Katie has died. And it sounds to me as if the authorities and those people who made mistakes still are going to be tortured to give up those answers to you over the coming months.
My point remains: who walks away from an unfinished job? That's not. I'm a professional. I've got the bit between the teeth, to coin a phrase, and I'm not. It's not finished. Once it's finished, yes, I'll toodle on. But no, not at the minute. It has to be finished, and it could be finished if they would just come clean
and answer the questions.
Answer questions, give us the details. We are getting a little bit more cooperation now, but it came at a price. Today, the policing board's meeting today, and they're supposedly talking about the misleading the information commissioner. The chief constable it's now 3 months since he's been asked to put a response, and he hasn't done it, as to why this was allowed to happen. But, everything is long finger. And that is whenever you get the retirements, and they're all, they're away.
Yeah, and people can forget about whatever mistakes they made or whatever incompetencies were involved in the investigation. Well, look, we'll come back to this. We'll be back to it when we have, another little bit of news, or you do get some of those answers to questions that you have asked and others have asked. So for the moment, Tanya, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
If you're a crimeworld.com subscriber, you've probably already binged on our latest exclusive podcast series, The Regency 10 Years On, from the hit that changed gangland forever. This 6-part anniversary special revisits that fateful day when David Byrne was shot dead at the Northside Hotel, igniting a bloody feud between the Kinahan and Hutch gangs, one of the deadliest rivalries in Irish history. Here's a taste of the new series, exclusive to crimeworld.com subscribers. So that Friday was one of those really quiet days. I mean, we all knew that Daniel Kinahan was in Dublin for the Clash of the Clans Boxing Weigh, and at least we knew he was due into Dublin the next day. That Clash of the Clans match had been heavily advertised, but the day itself there was just little going on.
So there was very little happening that day. It's February. It's kind of a quiet enough time for news in general. And Alan Cherry and Ernie Leslie were on the road. They were at another story actually in Finglas.
What was that? Do you remember?
Well, it was one of these classic sort of district court stories where a guy I think some teenagers had thrown stones at his car, and he got out and slapped the teenager. Always great kind of human stories, because some people feel sorry for the teenagers and some people don't. And so Alan had been out there, but the guy had moved on. He'd called out to his house to see if he wanted to talk. He'd moved on, he wasn't there. And we discussed going to the Regency earlier. And I said, look, just go along and see what happens. Divert there. We obviously weren't expecting anything. And obviously that point of Alan being there would be the subject of conspiracy, but we'll get into that at a later point.
For sure. So it was a case really that day of, one thing hadn't worked out, so go to the next. But also there was definitely a general sense of, if we could be there, just in case.
Yes, and as you said, to see who was standing beside the Kinahans and who wasn't from that bigger organised crime group. So Alan and Ernie went out. I got a call. I think you got a call almost simultaneously, but I got a call from Alan. I'd spoken to him earlier on the day saying, see what happens. And he phoned me up and said, there's after being a shooting and I think we've got a picture. And I actually went, yeah, very funny. But of course, he stopped me and said, no, I'm serious. There's some guys come out with a gun, there's shots fired, and there's total and utter chaos. And, our first thought is, get yourself safe. I have to admit, my second thought was, I hope they did get good pictures. But, you're still thinking they have to get safe. I mean, I know you probably got a similar call because Ernie and Alan obviously were in the same Jeep.
And of course, Ernie's the guy taking the photographs,
yes.
So he's on the phone to me. So I actually had gone for a pizza for lunch and I had come back over to the office and the phone rings and it was Ernie. And I answered and he was panicked on the other end of the phone. This was real high octane stuff. And he's still trying to take photos. He's trying to tell me what's happened. He's told me he thinks he's got a good one of one of the shooters as they were running from the scene. He was trying to call up the photograph on the back of his camera.
Yeah.
Because it would have taken him a while to get it onto a screen, but he'd also sent it into the office.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So he was kind of in the middle of doing a number of things. And as I was on the phone to him from memory, the photograph came into the office and we put it up on the big screen. And it was clear to see that this wasn't just one of the shooters as he suspected, but it was two. One of them was dressed as a woman.
Which is, of course, there was also this confusing story about guards coming in with weapons, and obviously we know now that they weren't ERU guys, they were guys dressed as them. But Alan was telling me this, there was talk of these guards, and then obviously there was, the crowd fleeing from the scene. So it was all confusing. But as you said, Ernie had taken a picture of the back of his camera. People will know what the photographer's cameras look like, and they have a little digital screen. So you don't see it in great detail. But we knew this is a once-in-a-lifetime photograph has been gotten.
Yeah, as soon as it came in. And of course, look, the newsrooms aren't as busy as they used to be. They used to be very busy, buzzy places with phones ringing everywhere. And it felt like a proper newsroom that day. I remember everybody's phone was going. People were hearing little bits about it. The news was starting to break about it. And of course, we were there sitting in the office with this photo. There's that sort of news sense in you that you want to run this.
Yeah.
And at the time, we weren't putting stuff up online. This would have been held for the paper on the Sunday, and this is a Friday afternoon. We had something really special here. But we also, I think, knew the guards were going to be desperate for that picture because they were two gunmen running from a scene of a crime. So it was a very compromised situation, and there was a bit of arguments going on, and there was voices were raised.
Totally. I mean, because it is complex. I mean, normally the journalism likes to keep itself separate from the Gardaí investigations. So Garda investigations go on and journalism reports on them. But obviously then you're put in this compromising position because you have guys running out visibly with handguns in their hands. And, they're obviously then disappeared into the ether. And you have to have a discussion about what is your civic responsibility in terms of, do you help the guards? You don't want these armed gunmen to run down the street and kill another few people. So it was a complex one, and people were aware straight away that the guards are going to want these pictures and want to use it for their purposes. And we also have our purposes, which is to tell what happened and to report on the news. So there was a conflict straight away.
From my memory, as the afternoon went on and, I was talking to contacts and to other people who were involved in crime journalism, etc., it became apparent that there were no guards at the weigh-in. That in actual fact, the guards didn't seem to be there at all. They were called literally by the hotel and had arrived in response to what had already gone on. Of course, David Byrne had been shot dead in the reception of the hotel. We were getting photographs in later in the day, which showed a very shocked-looking Liam Byrne standing outside the hotel, his hands in his pockets, standing beside his cousin Liam Rowe, another significant cartel member. There was no sign of Daniel Kinahan. I was getting calls from people who were telling me that these professional killers had been flown into the country and had already been flown out. There was rumours, there was spin, and also there was the general, I suppose, conversations in regards to, oh my God, what is going to happen next? I mean, all anyone knew for sure was something was going to happen. David Byrne was a very, very senior lieutenant. He was also from criminal royalty from the Byrne family. His brother-in-law is Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. His brother is Liam Byrne, and he's very much at the heart of the Kinahan cartel. We knew from the beginning that this attack had occurred as part of the rivalry between the Kinahan and Hutch factions of what was once the one organisation. And I think everybody was really trying to predict what this might lead to, but nobody could have guessed.
Nobody could have guessed. And of course, those rumours straight away went around. It was straight away focused on the Hutch gang. But at this time, if you remember, while there had been other incidents, for example, an attempted hit on Jerry Hutch in Lanzarote, those incidents weren't always public. People were straight away thinking this isn't the type of normal organised crime operation. They were looking at the weapons, saying, is there a paramilitary organisation involved here? Nobody knew fully. And of course, what people did fear straight away was, no matter what, people knew how big and how powerful the Kinahans had become, and the likelihood of them not striking back was inevitable. That blood was going to flow.
That bit absolutely 100%. But at that very early stage, I recall contacts of mine suggesting that the Hutches were an army. Did they have the backing of the dissidents? Was this going to, were they going to be very heavily armed because of that? They had contacts in the north. It was like as if people were trying to size up how two Premiership teams were going to play against one another. That's what it felt like. You've been listening to an extract from The Regency, 10 years on from the hit that changed gangland forever. Visit crimeworld.com and subscribe to hear the full series now. And you'll also get exclusive access to our other podcast deep dives on the Dapper Don, Christy Kinahan, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, and more.